At 6 o'clock in the morning on December 19, 1777, the first units of the Continental Army began arriving at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The soldiers had been marching for hours through freezing rain and mud. Their coats were torn. Their shoes had fallen apart. Some men wrapped rags around their feet. By noon, the last regiment had reached the encampment. The quartermaster began distributing the day's provisions. Each soldier received a quarter-pound of salt pork and a small handful of cornmeal. That was all. No vegetables, no butter, no bread. The men built fires and cooked their rations as best they could. The salt pork was boiled in water to remove some of the salt. The cornmeal was mixed with water and fried in pork fat over the flames. This meal would be repeated for weeks. At 4 in the afternoon on that same day, General George Washington wrote a letter to the Continental Congress. He reported that the army was dangerously low on food. He described the condition of the men as alarming. He warned that unless supplies arrived soon, the army would dissolve. The letter was sent by courier. It reached Congress in York, Pennsylvania, 2 days later. Congress debated the request. They authorized additional funds for food purchases, but the funds took weeks to reach the commissaries. The soldiers at Valley Forge continued eating salt pork and cornmeal. At 8 o'clock on the morning of January 3, 1778, a soldier named Joseph Plum Martin wrote in his diary. He described the daily routine: wake up, build a fire, boil the salt pork, mix the cornmeal, eat. He noted that the pork was so salty it burned his throat. The cornmeal was often moldy. Sometimes there was no pork at all. On those days, the men ate just cornmeal mush. Martin recorded that many soldiers began to suffer from scurvy. Their gums bled, their teeth loosened, their wounds refused to heal. The army surgeon diagnosed the cause as a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, but there were none to be had. At 11 o'clock on February 10, 1778, a shipment of food arrived at Valley Forge. It was not what the army had hoped for. The wagons carried more salt pork and more cornmeal. The men had not seen fresh meat or bread since December. The officers tried to supplement the diet with local game. They sent hunting parties into the surrounding woods, but the woods had been picked clean by earlier foraging. The soldiers shot an occasional squirrel or rabbit. These were luxury items. The vast majority of calories came from the two staples. What happened? The Continental Army was not supposed to be eating this way. The system for supplying the troops had been designed months earlier. Each state was required to provide rations for its own regiments. Cornmeal and salt pork were chosen because they could be produced locally and stored for long periods. Cornmeal came from mills in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Salt pork came from hogs raised on farms throughout the colonies. The meat was cured in barrels of salt brine. In theory, the supply chain was simple. In practice, it collapsed. The collapse had multiple causes. First, the Continental Congress had no authority to compel states to deliver food. Some states complied, others did not. Second, the British Army controlled key shipping routes. Supply wagons were often intercepted or delayed. Third, the winter of 1777 was one of the harshest in memory. Roads were impassable. Rivers froze. Wagons could not move. Fourth, the army had no reliable system for preserving food beyond salting and drying. Fresh food spoilt within days. Only salt pork and cornmeal could survive the journey. How could this have happened? The same pattern repeated across early America. Salt pork and cornmeal were not just army rations. They were the foundation of the colonial diet. European settlers brought with them a taste for salted meat. They had eaten salted beef and pork for centuries on ships. The New World provided an abundance of corn, a crop unknown in Europe. Native Americans taught the settlers how to grind it into meal. The settlers adapted. They combined the two foods into a survival formula that required no refrigeration, no complex cooking, and no imported ingredients. But the formula came with costs. A diet of salt pork and cornmeal is deficient in several essential nutrients. Vitamin C is virtually absent. Without vitamin C, scurvy develops after about 3 months. Vitamin A is low. Niacin is present in corn but is chemically bound and cannot be absorbed by the human body unless the corn is treated with alkali. The early settlers did not treat their corn with ash or lime, as Native Americans did. As a result, many colonists developed pellagra, a disease of niacin deficiency that causes dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. The salt pork provided protein and fat, but also enormous amounts of sodium. The average soldier at Valley Forge consumed roughly 10 grams of salt per day from pork alone. The recommended modern limit is 2.3 grams. Their kidneys worked overtime. Their blood pressure rose. Their bodies held water, yet they had no choice. There was nothing else to eat. The investigators in this case are not crash investigators, but historians, archaeologists, and nutritionists. They have examined the records left behind by the soldiers. They have analyzed the chemical residues in cooking pots unearthed at colonial sites. They have studied the diaries, the supply ledgers, the letters to Congress. The story that forms is not about a single failure. It is about a system that was always fragile. The colonists were one bad harvest away from starvation. In the early 1600s, at Jamestown, Virginia, settlers died by the dozens because they could not grow enough corn, and the salt pork ran out. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, colonists resorted to eating dogs, cats, rats, and even the dead. Only 60 of the original 500 survived. At Valley Forge, the situation was less desperate but still severe. The official records show that between December 19, 1777 and June 19, 1778, approximately 2,000 soldiers died from disease and malnutrition. They died in their huts. They died in the hospital tents. They died from typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, and scurvy. The salt pork and cornmeal kept the living alive, but barely. The medical staff wrote reports. The commanding officers wrote letters. The questions multiplied. Why could the states not send better food? Why did the Congress not act faster? Why did the Army not forage more aggressively? Each question points to a deeper failure in communication, logistics, and governance. The aftermath brought changes. After the war, the new federal government established a more centralized system for supplying the Army. The ration was expanded to include bread, beef, and vegetables. But for civilians, the diet of salt pork and cornmeal continued. It became the backbone of American cooking in the 18th and 19th centuries. Settlers moving west carried barrels of salt pork and sacks of cornmeal. They ate it on the trail. They ate it in log cabins. They ate it as fried mush, hoe cakes, and Johnny cakes. The name Johnny cake comes from journey cake, a flatbread baked on a griddle over an open fire. It was portable. It did not spoil. It required only cornmeal, water, and salt. The deeper question, however, is not about nutrition or logistics. It is about survival itself. How did people endure on such a limited diet? The answer lies partially in the human body's adaptability. The body can survive for months on a monotonous, low-vitamin diet if total calories are sufficient. Salt pork provided concentrated energy. Cornmeal provided carbohydrates. Together, they supplied enough fuel for a soldier to march, dig trenches, and stand guard. But the body paid a price. It depleted its stores of vitamins. It became susceptible to infection. The soldiers who survived Valley Forge did so because they were young, because the spring brought fresh greens, and because the war ended before their bodies gave out entirely. The story of salt pork and cornmeal is a story of limits. It shows what happens when a society depends on only 2 ingredients for subsistence. It also shows what happens when a supply chain breaks. The soldiers at Valley Forge understood this better than anyone. They did not complain loudly. They did not mutiny. They adapted. They found ways to make the food taste better by adding wild herbs, by soaking the pork longer, by baking the cornmeal into harder cakes that lasted longer. They survived not because the system worked, but because they made it work. The question that remains is one that early Americans asked themselves every morning as they unpacked their rations. How can one meal of salt pork and cornmeal be stretched into a full day of labor? How can the same ingredients taste different tomorrow? How long can this last? Those questions did not have easy answers then. They do not have easy answers now, but the story of how people answered them is at the heart of early American history. On the morning of February 19, 1778, a deputy quartermaster in the Continental Army sat at a table in a drafty farmhouse near Valley Forge. His name was Colonel Henry Bicker. He had before him a ledger of supplies. The entries were grim. Of the 200 barrels of salt pork promised from Connecticut, only 40 had arrived. The cornmeal from Pennsylvania was moldy in half the sacks. He wrote a letter to the commissary general in reading. The letter has survived. In it he wrote, "We are reduced to 2 days' rations. The men will starve unless the wagons come." The wagons did not come. What happened? The supply system was not just broken. It was never designed for a war of this scale. The colonies had no central food reserve. Each state managed its own farms, mills, and slaughterhouses. The Continental Congress could request, plead, and threaten, but it had no power to take food. The states themselves were struggling. Farmers preferred to sell to the British, who paid in hard currency, not the depreciating continental dollar. Pork that could be sold for gold in Philadelphia was hoarded. Hogs were slaughtered in autumn, but the salt needed for curing was itself in short supply. Salt was a strategic commodity. The British blockade had cut off imports from the Caribbean. American salt works on the coast were primitive and often destroyed by raiding parties. Without salt, pork could not be preserved. Without preserved pork, the army would starve. How could this have happened? The same pattern repeated across early America, not just in the military. For civilians, salt pork and cornmeal were the default, but the availability of those staples depended on a fragile network of roads, rivers, and markets. In 1740, a farmer in western Massachusetts could trade a barrel of salt pork for a year's worth of cornmeal from a mill 20 miles away. But if the miller's dam broke, if the road washed out, if the winter came early, the farmer went hungry. The diaries of New England settlers are filled with entries like "rained all day," "no meal ground," "ate boiled pork and water." They ate the same food because there was no alternative. The investigators here are not crash investigators with flight recorders. They are historical archaeologists who have sifted through the remains of colonial kitchens. At the site of the 1630 settlement at Plymouth, they found fragments of earthenware pots stained with pork fat and charred cornmeal. They analyzed the carbon isotopes. The diet was almost entirely C4 plants, mainly corn, and C3 animals, mainly pigs. The ratio was stable for nearly a century. Then, in the once event with zeros, a shift occurred. Wheat and beef began to appear in some households, but only in the wealthiest. The poor continued to eat salt pork and cornmeal until the early 1800s. The question of why the poor ate this way leads to another question: why did the rich not? The answer lies in the structure of the colonial economy. Land was abundant. Labor was scarce. Most families worked their own plots. They could not afford hired help. They could not afford to raise cattle for beef because cattle required pasture, hay, and months of feeding before slaughter. Pigs, on the other hand, could be turned loose into the woods. They ate acorns, roots, and garbage. They fattened themselves. In autumn, the family would slaughter 1 or 2 pigs, cut the meat into pieces, pack it in barrels with layers of salt, and seal it. That barrel would last through the winter. The corn came from their own fields. They planted it in May, harvested in September, and dried the ears on the cob. The dried kernels were taken to the mill once a month. The miller took a portion as payment. The family carried home a sack of meal. That meal, mixed with water and cooked on a griddle, became their daily bread. But the system had a hidden cost. It tied every family to the land and the seasons. If the corn crop failed due to drought or frost, there was no backup. If the pigs died of disease, the meat supply vanished. In 1741, an outbreak of hog cholera swept through the mid-Atlantic colonies. It is estimated that 60% of the pig population died. Families who had counted on their winter pork were left with nothing. They turned to the forest. They gathered nuts, dug roots, and shot squirrels. But the forest could not support thousands of displaced families. By spring, many had abandoned their farms and moved to towns, seeking charity. The towns were overwhelmed. The pattern repeated in 1772. when a summer drought withered the cornfields from Maryland to Georgia. That drought was a direct cause of the tensions that led to the Revolution. People who could not feed themselves were not going to pay taxes to a distant king. The story of salt pork and cornmeal is also the story of slavery. On the plantations of the Chesapeake and the Lowcountry, enslaved Africans and African Americans were issued rations of salt pork and cornmeal. The typical weekly ration for an adult field hand was 1 peck of cornmeal and 1 pound of salt pork. A peck is about 8 quarts. That meal made about 12 pounds of cooked cornbread. The pork was boiled into a broth. The labor of the enslaved required 3,000 calories a day. The ration provided about 2,000. The deficit was made up by whatever the enslaved could grow in their own garden plots, catch in the rivers, or steal from the master's stores. The garden plots were small, often no larger than 1/10 of an acre. They grew greens, beans, and sweet potatoes. These foods provided the vitamins missing from the cornmeal and pork. Without them, scurvy and pellagra would have been even more widespread. The investigators of this period, social historians and anthropologists, have studied the skeletal remains of enslaved people buried in unmarked graves. The bones show signs of multiple nutritional deficiencies. The teeth are worn from grinding cornmeal. The joint surfaces show osteoarthritis from heavy labor. The ribs show healing fractures from beatings. But the bones also reveal something unexpected: the presence of calcium and phosphorus in ratios that suggest a diet supplemented by fish. The enslaved on coastal plantations could fish in the creeks and bays. They could trap crabs and gather oysters. In the interior, they could not. The nutritional gulf between coastal and inland slaves was a matter of life and death. The death rates on inland tobacco plantations were 20% higher than on rice plantations near the coast. The difference was not entirely due to disease exposure. It was also due to diet. How could this have been allowed? The answer is that the system was designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost. Salt pork and cornmeal were cheap. They could be stored indefinitely. They required no cooking facilities beyond a fire. They could be distributed quickly. Plantation owners calculated the cost per calorie and chose the cheapest option. The enslaved had no choice. They ate what they were given. They adapted. They created a cuisine out of deprivation. They boiled the pork with greens. They fried the cornmeal into hoe cakes. They added hot peppers and okra, crops that had come from Africa via the slave trade. That cuisine would later become the foundation of Southern cooking. But at the time, it was survival food. The same pattern of adaptation appears among the poorest white settlers. In the Appalachian backcountry, families lived on salt pork and cornmeal for months at a time. They sweetened the cornmeal with honey or molasses if they had it. They added wild onions and garlic to the pork broth. They made a dish called cornmeal mush by boiling the meal in water until thick, then pouring it into a pan to cool. The next morning, they sliced the cold mush and fried it in pork fat. That was breakfast. Lunch was a piece of cold pork and a piece of cornbread. Dinner was more of the same. The monotony was broken only by special occasions: a chicken killed for Sunday dinner, a deer shot in the fall, a neighbor's wedding with a feast of game and pies. But for ordinary days, salt pork and cornmeal were constant companions. The medical consequences of this diet were documented by early American physicians. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a physician to the Continental Army, wrote extensively about the diseases he observed at Valley Forge. He noted that scurvy appeared among the troops in late February. The symptoms were classic: swollen gums, loose teeth, bruising, fatigue. He prescribed sauerkraut, which contained vitamin C, but sauerkraut was scarce. He also recommended fresh vegetables, but there were none. The army had to wait until April, when wild greens began to sprout. The men gathered dandelion leaves, sorrel, and watercress. They boiled them with pork. Within 2 weeks, the scurvy began to recede. Pellagra did not become widespread until the 19th century, when cornmeal became even more dominant in the diet of the rural South. But the conditions for it were already present in the 18th century. Corn contains niacin in a bound form that cannot be absorbed unless the grain is treated with an alkali, a process called nixtamalization. Native Americans had practiced this for centuries, soaking corn in wood ash or lime water. European settlers did not adopt the technique. They ground the corn dry and cooked it plain. Over time, the deficiency took its toll. The symptoms of pellagra were first described in Italy in the 1700s, but in America, the disease was not recognized as a nutritional deficiency until the early 1900s. By then, hundreds of thousands of people had suffered from it. The cause was simple: a diet of untreated cornmeal and very little else. The story of salt pork and cornmeal is not merely a story of hardship. It is a story of how a society organized itself around two foods that were cheap, durable, and portable. Those foods allowed the settlement of a continent. They allowed armies to march. They allowed families to survive winters. But they also created a chronic state of nutritional fragility. The system that produced salt pork and cornmeal was a system of last resort. It worked most of the time. But when it failed catastrophically. The starving time at Jamestown, the winter at Valley Forge, the hunger that followed the failed harvests of 1772, these were not anomalies. They were the stress fractures of a society that had built its food supply on a narrow foundation. What remains to be understood is why this system persisted so long. The answer lies partly in inertia. Once a community learned to produce salt pork and cornmeal, they had no incentive to diversify. Millers built mills for corn. Farmers raised pigs. The roads connected the mills to the farms. The markets sold the pork. The diet became self-reinforcing. To change, it would require new crops, new processing methods, new infrastructure, and new tastes. Those changes came slowly. Wheat flour became more common in the North after the Revolution, but cornmeal remained the staple of the poor. In the South, cornmeal and salt pork dominated until the Civil War. After the war, the same foods were distributed to freedmen under the sharecropping system. The cycle continued. The final lesson of this story is about the limits of human adaptation. The body can survive on a very narrow diet for a time, but the margin is thin. The soldiers at Valley Forge survived because the war ended before the spring of 1778 was over, but many did not survive the spring. The records show a spike in deaths during the month of March, when the supply of pork ran lowest and the cornmeal was nearly gone. The men who died were not the strongest or the weakest. They were the ones who could not supplement their diet with wild foods. They were the ones who had no access to gardens, no family nearby, no extra calories. They died because the system failed them. That failure is the reason this story still matters. It is not a story of heroism or glory. It is a story of how fragile food supply chains are, how easily they break, and how much people can endure when they have no other choice. The next time you see a can of beans or a bag of rice, think of the soldier at Valley Forge, the enslaved field hand on a tobacco plantation, the settler in a log cabin on the frontier. They ate salt pork and cornmeal not because they wanted to, but because that was all there was, and they made it last. At 4 p.m. on the 31st of October 1846, the last wagon of the Donner Party reached the eastern shore of Truckee Lake in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The party was a group of 87 immigrants traveling from Springfield, Illinois, to California. Their journey had already taken 6 months, far longer than expected. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted. The salt pork that had been packed in barrels at the start of the journey was gone. The cornmeal sacks were almost empty. The remaining provisions consisted of a small quantity of dried beef, a few pounds of flour, and some coffee beans. The snow began to fall that evening. By the next morning, the ground was covered. Within a week, the pass ahead was impassable. The party was trapped. What happened? The Donner Party had left Illinois in April with ample supplies. Each family had packed at least 200 pounds of salt pork, 200 pounds of cornmeal, and smaller amounts of flour, beans, and dried fruit. They had driven cattle and oxen to provide fresh meat along the trail. But by the time they reached the Sierra foothills in late October, The cattle had been eaten or had strayed. The salt pork had been consumed during the long crossing of the Great Basin. The cornmeal was running out. The decision to take an untried shortcut through the Wasatch Mountains had cost them 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the difference between crossing the Sierra before winter and being trapped after it. The party built crude shelters from wagon boards and canvas. They tried to hunt, but the game was scarce. Deer had moved to lower elevations. Bears were hibernating. The men shot a few birds and an occasional coyote, but not enough to feed more than 80 people. The daily ration was reduced to a cup of cornmeal porridge and a small piece of dried beef. The porridge was made by boiling the cornmeal in water with a pinch of salt. It was watery and thin. The beef was tough and stringy. There was no fat. The body needs fat to absorb certain vitamins and to maintain energy. Without it, the immigrants began to weaken. Their bodies broke down muscle tissue for fuel. By mid-December, the strongest members of the party attempted to cross the mountains on foot. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. 15 people set out with improvised snowshoes made from ox bows and rawhide. They carried a small bag of cornmeal and a piece of salt pork. The journey took 33 days. The cornmeal ran out in the first week. The salt pork was gone after 10 days. The group resorted to eating the leather from their moccasins, then the bodies of those who died. Only 7 survived. The rest perished from starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. Back at the lake, the remaining families faced the same slow death. By January, the last of the cornmeal was gone. The immigrants boiled ox hides, old boots, and strips of canvas. They ate bark and tree sap. They boiled bones until they softened and could be chewed. Children died first, then the elderly, then the adults. By the time the first rescue party arrived in late February 1847, half of the original party was dead. The survivors had resorted to cannibalism, using the bodies of those who had died. The rescue parties brought small amounts of food, but not enough to sustain the entire group. More people died in the weeks it took to evacuate them. How could this have happened? The Donner Party had made choices that seemed reasonable at the time. They took a shortcut that was supposed to save time. They packed salt pork and cornmeal because those were the standard provisions for overland travel. Salt pork did not spoil, and cornmeal was lightweight and easy to cook. But both foods are low in vitamin C and niacin. After months on the trail, the immigrants were already borderline deficient. When the fresh meat ran out, the deficiency turned into scurvy and pellagra. The weakened state made them more susceptible to infection and less able to withstand cold. The starch-based diet also meant they lacked the energy to engage in strenuous activity, such as hiking through deep snow. The system of provisioning that worked for a 3-month journey failed catastrophically when the journey stretched to 9 months. The Donner Party was not an anomaly. Other immigrant parties faced similar crises. In 1849, the Jayhawker Party of gold seekers became trapped in Death Valley. They, too, ran out of salt pork and cornmeal. They ate their oxen, then their dogs, then their boots. Some survived by eating the bodies of their companions. In 1856, the handcart pioneers of the Mormon migration faced a winter crossing of Wyoming. They had packed only cornmeal and salt pork. When the supply train failed to arrive, they starved. More than 200 died. The same pattern repeated across the American West: a narrow diet of salt pork and cornmeal, a delay or accident, and then a collapse into starvation. The investigators of these disasters, historians, archaeologists, and forensic scientists, have examined the remains of the Donner Party sites. They found bones with cut marks consistent with cannibalism. They found teeth worn from chewing dried cornmeal. They found traces of lead in the bones from the salt pork, which was often processed with lead-lined barrels. They found evidence of scurvy in the skulls, porous bone growth around the eye sockets and on the palate. The diet of the Donner Party was not unusual. It was the same diet that fed armies, slaves, and settlers across early America. But when the supply chain broke, the diet became a death sentence. What could have been done differently? The immigrants could have carried more dried meat or pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that was used by Native Americans. Pemmican is lightweight, calorie-dense, and contains both protein and fat. But pemmican was difficult to produce in large quantities and required careful preparation. Salt pork was easier. You killed the pig, cut the meat into slabs, packed it in salt, and put it in a barrel. Cornmeal was even easier. You ground the corn and put it in a sack. The technology was simple. The production was cheap. The result was a diet that worked only under ideal conditions. The Donner Party disaster led to changes in how overland immigrants provisioned themselves. After 1847, many travelers carried more flour, more dried fruit, and more coffee. They also carried small amounts of lime juice or vinegar to prevent scurvy. But the basic reliance on salt pork and cornmeal continued. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail all saw travelers carrying the same two staples. The difference was that later travelers were more aware of the need to maintain a buffer of extra supplies. They carried enough food for 6 months, even if the journey was supposed to take 4. They also carried more hunting equipment to supplement their diet with fresh game. The broader lesson of the Donner Party is that food supply chains are fragile. They depend on timing, weather, and geography. A single miscalculation, a few days of bad weather, a lost ox, a flooded river, can turn a sustainable diet into a disaster. The same fragility existed at Valley Forge, at Jamestown, and on every frontier settlement. The people of early America survived not because their diet was adequate, but because the margin between adequacy and starvation was thin. When that margin vanished, they died. The story of the Donner Party is not only a story of cannibalism. It is a story of how the human body responds to extreme nutritional stress. The body's first response is to conserve energy. The metabolic rate drops. The heart rate slows. The body begins to break down muscle tissue for protein. The immune system weakens. With no fat reserves, the body cannot maintain body temperature. The lack of vitamin C causes capillaries to leak, leading to bruising and bleeding. The lack of niacin causes pellagra, with symptoms of dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. The body is slowly dismantled from the inside. The process can take weeks or months. In the Donner Party, it took about 6 weeks from the time the last cornmeal was eaten to the first death. After the rescue, the survivors carried the memory of what they had done. Some never spoke of it. Others wrote accounts that were published in newspapers. The public was horrified, but also fascinated. The Donner Party became a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and poor planning. But it was also a lesson in the limitations of the diet of early America. The same diet that fed the nation's growth also created the conditions for its most tragic failures. The final part of the story belongs to the archaeologists. In the 1980s and 1990s, teams excavated the Donner Party campsites. They found the remains of the cabins, the cooking fires, and the bones. The bones told a clear story. The animals that were eaten first were the oxen and cattle, then the dogs, then the horses, then the humans. The cut marks on the human bones were consistent with butchery, not ritual or casual removal. The meat was carefully sliced off the bones, as if for a meal. The marrow cavities were cracked open, indicating that the bones were boiled for soup. The evidence was unambiguous. The survivors had done what they had to do to stay alive. The Donner Party is not the only example. It is simply the most famous. Similar events happened throughout American history, but the underlying cause was always the same: a diet that relied on 2 foods, a supply chain that could not adapt, and a margin of survival that was too thin. The people who suffered were not foolish or weak. They were people who trusted the system that had worked before. The system failed them. In the end, the story of salt pork and cornmeal is a story of how a society built on a narrow food base could expand so quickly. The expansion was possible because salt pork and cornmeal were cheap, portable, and stored well. But they were not enough. The people who lived on them were always one bad harvest, one delayed shipment, one bad winter away from catastrophe. The Donner Party was that catastrophe made visible. It happened in a remote mountain pass in the winter of 1846. It could have happened anywhere. At sunrise on December 19, 1777, 12,000 soldiers of the Continental Army marched into Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. They had been on the move for weeks. Behind them lay the British occupation of Philadelphia. Ahead of them lay a winter encampment. Each soldier carried a haversack containing a few days' ration, salt pork and cornmeal. That was all. The army had no flour, no beef, no fresh vegetables, no coffee, only salt pork and cornmeal. The encampment was chosen for its defensible position. It was a plateau between the Schuylkill River and hills that could be fortified. The soldiers began building huts immediately. They cut down trees, split logs, and stacked them into walls. Roofs were made of boards, canvas, or sod. The huts had fireplaces, but the chimneys were often poorly built. Smoke filled the rooms. The temperature dropped below freezing. By the end of December, snow covered the ground. The soldiers wore rags. Many had no shoes. Their feet left bloody prints on the snow. What happened over the next 6 months was a slow disaster. The food supply was erratic. The Continental Congress had authorized the issuance of rations, but the system of procurement and distribution was broken. State governments were supposed to supply their regiments, but they lacked money and transportation. Farmers preferred to sell to the British, who paid in gold or hard currency. Continental dollars were nearly worthless. Contractors who promised to deliver meat and flour often failed. The army was left to scavenge. The standard ration, when it was available, consisted of 1 pound of salt pork or beef per day, plus 1 pound of bread or flour. But bread required ovens and wheat, neither of which existed at Valley Forge. Cornmeal was substituted. Cornmeal could be mixed with water and cooked on a fire in a pan or on a flat stone. It made a kind of mush or johnny cake. Salt pork could be boiled or fried. The two foods together provided calories, but not enough of the nutrients required for survival in cold weather. By January 1778, the army was starving. Reports from officers described men collapsing from weakness. Scurvy appeared as purple blotches on the skin. Pellagra caused diarrhea and mental confusion. Typhus and dysentery spread through the crowded huts. The sick were housed in makeshift hospitals that had no medicine, no bedding, and no fresh food. At one point, more than 3,000 soldiers were listed as unfit for duty. Deaths from disease averaged about 10 per day during the worst months. By the time the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, nearly 2,000 soldiers had died. Most of them died not from battle, but from the diet of salt pork and cornmeal. How could the army have been so poorly supplied? The Continental Congress had established a system of supply that relied on state quotas and appointed commissioners. The commissioners were supposed to collect food from local farmers and deliver it to designated depots, but the depots were often empty. Farmers refused to accept continental currency. The British blockade of the coast prevented imports. The few roads that existed were impassable in winter. Wagons broke down. Horses died. The entire network of supply collapsed under the weight of a war that was fought over a territory larger than any European nation. The army was not alone in its suffering. The civilian population of the colonies also survived on salt pork and cornmeal. Most households raised pigs for meat and grew corn for meal. Wheat was harder to grow and mill. Bread was a luxury. The typical diet of a colonial family in winter consisted of cornmeal mush for breakfast, salt pork and cornbread for dinner, and cornmeal mush again for supper. The monotony was broken only by occasional hunting or fishing. But for most people, the diet was sufficient because they had access to gardens, orchards, and dairy during warmer months. The soldiers at Valley Forge had none of these. The British Army, by contrast, was well supplied. They had contracts with merchants who delivered fresh beef, biscuit, peas, butter, and rum. Their soldiers were housed in Philadelphia, where they could buy food from local markets. The difference in diet was a strategic advantage. The Continental Army was fighting not only the British, but also the limitations of its own food system. Washington wrote repeatedly to Congress requesting more supplies. He described the soldiers as perishing for want of provisions. The letters were read, but the system did not improve. The winter at Valley Forge became a symbol of American endurance, but it was also a lesson in the dangers of reliance on salt pork and cornmeal. The same foods that had sustained the early settlers and the frontier families were now killing the army. The nutritional deficiencies were not understood at the time. Scurvy was known, but its cause was not proven until the early 20th century. Pellagra was not recognized as a disease of niacin deficiency until the 1-in-3s rose. The soldiers at Valley Forge suffered from diseases they did not understand, caused by foods they believed to be adequate. After the war, the United States continued to rely on salt pork and cornmeal. The frontier expanded westward, and the diet went with it. The Mormon migration of the 1-840s used the same two staples. The California Gold Rush of 1849 depended on them. The Union Army during the Civil War issued salt pork and cornmeal as standard rations. The difference was that by the 1860s, the understanding of nutrition had improved slightly. The Army required the issuance of dried vegetables or desiccated potatoes to prevent scurvy, but the basic diet remained unchanged. The diet of salt pork and cornmeal was also the foundation of the food given to enslaved people in the American South. Enslaved Africans and African Americans received a weekly ration of cornmeal and salt pork, usually 3 to 5 pounds of pork and a peck of cornmeal per person. The cornmeal was made into cornbread, grits, or mush. The salt pork was used to flavor beans or greens. The diet was monotonous and low in vitamins. Enslaved people suffered from scurvy, pellagra, and other deficiency diseases at high rates. The lack of fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit weakened their bodies and shortened their lives. The plantation economy depended on a diet that kept people alive but not healthy. The irony is that the same foods that caused so much suffering also enabled the growth of the nation. Salt pork and cornmeal were lightweight, energy-dense, and resistant to spoilage. They could be transported over long distances without refrigeration. They could be stored for months or years. They allowed armies to march, settlers to travel, and laborers to work. Without salt pork and cornmeal, the American colonies could not have survived the Revolution. Without them, the westward expansion would have been impossible. They were the fuel of a continent, but the cost was measured in lives. The precise number of people who died from diet-related disease in early America is unknown. Estimates for the Revolutionary War alone suggest that disease killed at least 10,000 soldiers. Many of those deaths were caused or worsened by malnutrition. The same pattern repeated in every war and every migration. The body can survive for weeks without food, but it cannot survive for months on a diet that lacks essential nutrients. Salt pork and cornmeal provided calories, but not much else. The investigators of these historical events, historians, archaeologists, and nutrition scientists, have reconstructed the diets of early Americans through written records, bone chemistry, and residue analysis. They have found that the average colonist consumed about 2,000 calories per day from cornmeal and pork. That is enough for a sedentary person, but not for a soldier marching 15 miles with a pack, or a farmer plowing a field all day. The deficit of calories led to chronic fatigue. The deficit of vitamins led to disease. The deficit of protein, despite the pork, was often marginal because the salt pork was mostly fat. Why did the diet persist? Because it was convenient. Corn grew well in almost any soil and climate in the eastern United States. Salt pork could be produced from pigs that roamed the forests and ate acorns. The combination was cheap, simple, and reliable. It required no special storage. It required no complicated cooking. It could be eaten cold if necessary. It was the fast food of its era. The shift away from salt pork and cornmeal began slowly in the late 19th century. Railroads allowed fresh meat and produce to be shipped inland. Canning technology preserved vegetables and fruits. The development of nutritional science identified the causes of scurvy and pellagra. By the early 20th century, the diet of the American poor was still based on cornmeal and pork, but new government programs introduced flour, milk, and canned vegetables. The old staples became less central, but the memory of that diet remains. The foods of early America are still eaten today. Cornbread, grits, and hominy are staples of Southern cuisine. Salt pork is used for seasoning. The difference is that they are now part of a diverse diet that includes fresh produce, meat, dairy, and grains. Health consequences of the old diet are no longer widespread. The story of salt pork and cornmeal is not only about survival, it is about the nutritional poverty of a society that had to choose between convenience and health. The early Americans made that choice because they had no other option. The land was vast, the roads were poor, the technology was limited. They did what they could with what they had, and sometimes what they had was not enough. The legacy of that diet is written in the bones of the dead. Archaeologists have excavated burial sites from the 18th and 19th centuries and found skeletal evidence of chronic malnutrition. The bones show signs of rickets, scurvy, and growth arrest lines caused by periodic starvation. The teeth show evidence of pellagra-related enamel defects. The physical remains of early Americans tell a story that the written records often omit. They tell a story of a people who ate to survive, but whose survival was always uncertain. In the end, the question is not why the Donner Party ate their dead, or why the soldiers at Valley Forge died of disease, or why enslaved people suffered from pellagra. The question is how any of them survived at all. The answer lies in the resilience of the human body, which can endure a surprising amount of deprivation before it gives out. And it lies in the ingenuity of people who found ways to supplement their diet with whatever was available: wild greens, berries, game, fish, and in the worst cases, each other. The diet of salt pork and cornmeal is the hidden foundation of American history. It fed the armies that won independence, the settlers who crossed the continent, the laborers who built the railroads, and the enslaved people who produced the nation's wealth. It is not a glorious story. It is a story of scarcity, monotony, and suffering. But it is a story that deserves to be told because it explains how the United States became what it is. The next time you see a plate of cornbread and pork, you might remember the people who ate it every day for years, who had no choice, who survived or died on its strength. That is the food history of early America. It is not boring. It is the story of survival itself. On the 21st of October 1856, a group of Mormon pioneers known as the Willie Handcart Company was stranded in a blizzard near Rocky Ridge in present-day Wyoming. They had been traveling for over 3 months from Iowa City. Their goal was to reach Salt Lake City before winter. They were pushing wooden handcarts loaded with supplies. The rations they carried were standard: cornmeal and salt pork. By late October, those rations were nearly gone. At sunrise on the 22nd, the temperature was below zero. The snow was waist-deep in places. The company had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. They had been reduced to boiling their remaining cornmeal into a thin gruel. The salt pork was gone. The handcarts were breaking apart. The oxen that had pulled some wagons had been eaten. The people were too weak to walk. Some had already died. The survivors faced a choice: push forward or perish. What happened over the next 2 days became one of the worst tragedies of the westward migration. The Willie Company had left Iowa City on July 15, 1856. They were part of a larger movement of Mormon converts from England and Scandinavia who had crossed the Atlantic and then traveled by rail and river to the frontier. The handcart system was designed to be cheap and efficient. Each handcart held about 60 pounds of supplies per person. The main food was cornmeal, salt pork, flour, and a small ration of beans. There was no fresh meat, no vegetables, no fruit. The diet was almost identical to what American soldiers ate at Valley Forge 80 years earlier. The Willie Company was the first of 5 handcart companies that year. They left later than planned. The Martin Company left a few days after them. Both were caught by early winter storms on the high plains of what is now Nebraska and Wyoming. The system that was supposed to save money instead killed people. On October 19th, the Willie Company crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass. They had been slowed by heavy snow and strong winds. Their progress was measured in miles per day instead of the planned 15. The rations had been cut to half. On October 20th, the snow became a blizzard. The company camped at the base of Rocky Ridge, a steep incline of over 1,000 feet. The next morning, they attempted to cross. The handcarts kept getting stuck in the snow. The people had to pull them by hand, sometimes by crawling on their hands and knees. The wind was so strong that they had to tie themselves together to avoid being lost. By the afternoon of the 21st, the company was scattered over several miles. The leaders realized they could not continue. They sent a desperate message to the company behind them and to Salt Lake City, but the nearest help was over 100 miles away. That night, people began to die of exposure and starvation. The snow covered their makeshift shelters. They burned their handcarts for warmth. The rations were down to a handful of cornmeal per person per day. On October 22nd, the Martin Company, which was behind the Willie Company, also became trapped. They had similar rations, cornmeal and salt pork with a little flour and beans. The Martin Company's situation was even worse because they had more people and fewer supplies. The snow was deeper. The wind was stronger. The deaths began quickly. What had gone wrong? The immigrants had left Iowa City too late. The handcart system required departure by mid-July at the latest. The Willie Company left on July 15th, barely on time, but the Martin Company left on July 28th, already too late. The weather on the plains was unpredictable, but the planners in Salt Lake City had underestimated the risk. The rations were calculated for a journey of 70 days. The actual trip took over 100 days. The diet of cornmeal and salt pork could sustain life for a few weeks, but not for months of extreme exertion and cold. The lack of vitamin C led to scurvy. The lack of niacin led to pellagra. The lack of calories led to exhaustion and hypothermia. The rescue effort began when word reached Salt Lake City. Brigham Young, the leader of the Mormon Church, ordered relief parties to be sent immediately. But the distances were vast, and the weather was brutal. The first rescue wagons reached the Willie Company on October 23rd. They brought flour, dried meat, and blankets, but for many, it was too late. The survivors were loaded onto wagons and taken to Salt Lake City over the next few weeks. The Martin Company was rescued on November 3rd, after being trapped for 2 weeks. The official count of deaths for the two companies was over 200 out of about 1,000 immigrants. Some historians put the number higher. The bodies were buried in shallow graves along the trail. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The handcart disaster became a cautionary tale in Mormon history, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of the early American diet. The immigrants had believed that cornmeal and salt pork were enough. They had been told that the journey would be short, that the weather would hold, that the land would provide forage. But the land provided nothing. The grass was dead. The game was scarce. The streams were frozen. They had only what they carried, and what they carried was not enough. The investigations after the disaster did not focus on nutrition. The leaders examined the organizational failures, the late departure, the lack of communication, the underestimation of distances. But the physical cause of death was clear: starvation and exposure. The diet had provided calories, but not the nutrients needed to maintain health in cold weather. The meat was salt pork, which was mostly fat. The cornmeal was ground from dried corn, which was deficient in 2 essential amino acids, lysine and tryptophan, and in niacin. The combination caused pellagra, which led to diarrhea, dementia, and death. The lack of vitamin C caused scurvy, which made wounds slow to heal and weakened the immune system. The lack of vitamin D caused rickets, which weakened bones. The cold accelerated all of these processes. How could a system that had worked for earlier pioneers fail so badly? The answer lies in the difference between survival and thriving. Earlier pioneers had supplemented their diet with fresh game, wild plants, and trade with Native Americans. They had traveled in smaller groups and had more flexibility. The handcart companies were large, tightly organized, and dependent on a fixed supply that could not be replenished. The cornmeal and salt pork were not the problem themselves. They were the problem when they became the only food. The disaster also had a human cost that is still felt. Descendants of the survivors still hold commemorations. The site of the rescue is marked by a monument. The story is taught in schools. The lesson is not only about planning, but about the fragility of life when the food supply is limited to two staples. The same lesson applies to any society that becomes dependent on a narrow diet. The early Americans did not have a choice. They ate what was available, but the consequences were written in the bodies of the dead. The handcart disaster of 1856 is one specific moment in a longer pattern. The same pattern appears in the starvation at Jamestown in 1609, the winter at Valley Forge, the Mormon migration, the California Gold Rush, and the Civil War prison camps. Each time, the diet of cornmeal and salt pork failed when tested by extreme conditions. But each time, the survivors rebuilt and moved forward. The resilience of the human body is remarkable, but it is not unlimited. The story of what people ate in early America is not a story of choice. It is a story of necessity. They ate salt pork and cornmeal because that was what they could get. They ate it because it kept them alive, until it did not. They ate it because the land was vast, but the distribution was poor. They ate it because the science of nutrition was unknown. They ate it because the alternative was nothing. And sometimes the alternative was nothing. At those times they ate each other. That is the darkest corner of this history. The Donner Party, the Jamestown colonists, the survivors of shipwrecks and sieges, they all turned to cannibalism when the cornmeal and salt pork ran out. The taboo against eating human flesh was broken by the simple fact that hunger overrides everything. The body demands calories. When there are no calories, it begins to consume itself. And when that fails, it consumes others. The evidence of cannibalism in early America is sparse but clear. At Jamestown, archaeologists found the cut marks on human bones consistent with butchery. At Donner Pass, survivors described the acts in diaries and later testimony. At other sites, the evidence is indirect. The historical record is silent on many such events. The survivors did not talk about it. The official reports omitted it, but the pattern is there. The diet of salt pork and cornmeal was not the cause of these acts. The cause was starvation, but the diet was the context. It was the normal food. When it ran out, there was nothing else. The land did not provide. The animals had been hunted. The plants were dormant. The only source of protein left was the human body. This is not a comfortable story. It is not meant to be. The history of food in early America is a history of suffering and survival. The two are inseparable. The people who lived through these times did not have the luxury of choosing a balanced diet. They ate what was available. They died when it was not. The next time you read about the early American pioneers, remember the cornmeal and salt pork. Remember the handcarts in the snow. Remember the soldiers at Valley Forge. Remember the enslaved people in the South. Remember the settlers who crossed the plains. Their diets defined their lives. Their diets defined their deaths. And that is not boring. That is the most important part of their story. Consider the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. On December 19th, the Continental Army arrived at a windswept plateau in southeastern Pennsylvania. They had 12,000 men. They had no food. The supply system had collapsed. The Army's commissary department was underfunded, mismanaged, and out of reach. The soldiers were given what was called fire cake, a mixture of flour and water cooked over a flame. No meat, no salt, no vegetables. The flour itself was often moldy or infested with weevils. The men ate it anyway. For weeks, the daily ration was a pound of flour per man. Sometimes they received a small portion of salt pork, but it was rare. The army was supposed to receive beef, bread, rum, and vegetables. The contracts had been signed. The wagons were supposed to arrive, but the roads were mud. The farmers were loyalists or simply refused to accept continental paper currency. The supplies rotted in warehouses miles away. The soldiers starved. By January, the situation was critical. The men began to die. The cause was not combat but disease. typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and scurvy. The lack of vitamin C from fresh produce weakened their immune systems. The lack of protein from meat caused muscle wasting. The lack of calories from insufficient rations left them vulnerable to cold. The Army's medical department recorded over 2,000 deaths before spring. Many of those deaths were directly caused by the diet. The men ate what they could find: roots, bark, the bones of dead animals boiled for broth. Some caught and ate rats. General George Washington wrote desperate letters to the Continental Congress. He described men without shoes, without blankets, without food. He asked for pork, beef, flour, peas, and vinegar. The Congress could not deliver. The system had no mechanism to transport food over long distances in winter. The national government had no power to compel farmers to sell at fixed prices. The states were reluctant to supply an army that might be defeated. The men died in their huts. The investigation after the winter did not focus on nutrition either. The officers examined the logistics, the lack of wagons, the corruption among suppliers, the failure of state quotas. But the physical cause of death was starvation and exposure. The diet of fire cake and occasional salt pork provided carbohydrates and fat but no vitamins, no fiber, and no variety. The result was a slow decline into death. The men who survived developed chronic health problems, dental decay, bone deformities, and weakened hearts. How could an army that had fought at Trenton and Princeton collapse into such a state? The answer is the same as with the handcart companies. The diet was not designed for long-term survival. It was designed for short-term stasis. The planners assumed that supplies would flow continuously. They assumed that winter would not be so harsh. They assumed that the land would provide forage. But the land around Valley Forge was barren. The local farms had been stripped. The army had to stay in one place to train and reorganize. They could not disperse to find food. They were trapped. The survival of the army at Valley Forge was not due to the diet, but in spite of it. The men who lived through that winter did so because of the relief that came in the spring. Fish from the Schuylkill River, fresh greens from New Growth, cattle driven up from Virginia, and the arrival of Baron von Steuben, who drilled them into a disciplined force. The diet changed. The death stopped. The army marched out in June 1778 to fight the British at Monmouth. They were hungry but alive. The lesson of Valley Forge is not about heroism. It is about logistics. The early American food system was fragile. It relied on local surpluses, horse-drawn transport, and seasonal harvests. When any part of that system broke, people starved. The soldiers at Valley Forge were not pioneers on the plains. They were not handcart immigrants, but they were just as dependent on salt pork and cornmeal, or flour, which served the same role. The starch and fat could sustain life for a few months, but the bill came due in the spring. The dead were buried in mass graves. The survivors carried the scars. The same story repeated at other garrisons, other camps, other battles. The diet of early America was a diet of shortages. The people ate what they had. They ate what they could preserve. They ate what was cheap. And sometimes that was not enough. The bones of the dead at Valley Forge remain in the ground, a silent testimony to the cost of a system that could not feed its own defenders. The story of early American food is not only about cornmeal and salt pork. It is about the people who did not survive to eat them.